Before I tell you about the exact moment my family's entire fake reality collapsed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Thank you for being here. Please grab a warm cup of water, sit down, and listen to me tell the whole story. Welcome to the channel. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old, and I restore rare and antique books for a living. I run a custom archival and letterpress studio out of a narrow, drafty old townhouse in Providence, Rhode Island. It is quiet, incredibly solitary, and meticulous work. I spend my days repairing water-damaged leather journals from the 19th century, rebinding heavy family Bibles for strangers, and carefully gluing broken, fragile spines back together using tiny bone folders and specialized adhesives. I am completely used to fixing things that are falling apart. I spend hours looking at the damage someone else caused and figuring out how to make the foundation strong again. Maybe that is exactly why my family assumed I would always be there to fix them, too. They looked at me and saw someone whose entire purpose was to repair their messes without ever asking for credit. To understand exactly what happened last Christmas, you need to deeply understand the people who were sitting at my dining room table. My father, Walter Bennett, was a retired local contractor. He was a large, imposing man who believed that every single favor he ever did for you was a binding, lifetime investment in your complete obedience. If he spent an hour fixing a leaky pipe under your sink, you owed him your total submission and respect for the next decade. He loved to stand in the middle of a room, cross his thick arms, and say things like, "Family is about showing up," but what he really meant, what he always meant was, "Family is about people showing up for me." My mother, Diane, was a completely different kind of exhausting. She collected sympathy the exact same way some people collect vintage ornaments. Everything in her life was always a massive tragedy, and she was always the long-suffering victim who just needed a little more grace and a lot more attention from everyone around her. She was a master of the quiet sigh, the tearful phone call, the subtle implication that her life was harder than anyone else's. And then there was my younger sister, Megan. Megan had perfected the absolute art of standing just close enough to a disaster to enjoy watching it burn, without ever getting blamed for actually striking the match. She was the golden child who could do no wrong, mostly because she never took responsibility for anything long enough to be held accountable. The story my parents told the rest of the world, especially the people at my mother's large community church, was very simple and incredibly effective. It went exactly like this. Poor Claire, always overwhelmed, always needing help with the children, always one step away from a complete mental and financial breakdown. That specific version of me was incredibly useful to them. It made Walter look like a heroic, protective patriarch who was generously keeping his struggling daughter afloat, and it made Diane look like a selfless saint of a grandmother. But the reality behind closed doors, the reality that I lived every single day, was entirely different. 3 years ago, I went through a terrible, deeply traumatic divorce. It was not a quiet, mutual separation. My ex-husband fought me on absolutely everything just to punish me for leaving. The custody battle for our 2 young children, Noah and Elsie, was brutal and completely draining. Every single meeting with my lawyer felt like walking through an emotional and financial minefield. My lawyer sat me down in his sterile office, looked at my paperwork, and warned me it would be a long, very expensive road. He told me I needed to prepare for a marathon, not a sprint. So, I put my head down and worked harder than I ever had in my entire life. I built my life back together, brick by brick, page by page. I implemented a strict budget. No flashy spending, no waste, no pretending to keep up with anyone. I relied entirely on my salary from the restoration studio to keep the lights on, buy the groceries, pay the mortgage on the townhouse, and make sure I was regularly putting money into Noah and Elsie's college fund. I learned exactly how expensive human dignity could be, and I paid the price gladly because it meant peace for my kids. What the neighbors, the extended family, and the church friends absolutely did not see was how much of my hard-earned money I had quietly pushed into my parents' and sisters' bank accounts over the last 2 years. It started shortly after my uncle passed away. My parents received a decent-sized inheritance after his funeral. It should have been a safety net for their retirement. Instead, They blew through it in a matter of months on luxury house upgrades they absolutely did not need. A new kitchen island, imported tile, a massive television. Less than a year later, Walter needed minor knee surgery. When his massive medical deductible was due, Diane called me on a Tuesday morning, sobbing hysterically into the phone. She said they were completely broke, the bank accounts were empty, and they were too embarrassed to ask the bank for a personal loan. She begged me for help. I swallowed my frustration, pulled money out of my emergency savings, and paid the hospital bill directly. Then came Megan. When Megan's husband, Ben, got passed over for a major promotion at his corporate job, their inflated lifestyle suddenly caught up with them. They had leased cars they couldn't afford and bought clothes to impress people they didn't even like. Their mortgage payment bounced. Megan called me in an absolute panic, crying that they were going to lose the house and the neighborhood would know. I floated them $1,800. They swore they would pay it back when things stabilized. They never did. In fact, they asked for another $900 the very next month. When Diane's property tax bill came up short one spring, I covered it. When my nephew needed a deposit for his braces because their dental insurance had a massive gap, guess who wired the money? Me. Every single time. It was always framed as a temporary, desperate crisis. And then, a month later, they would treat me like it had never happened. They would go back to making sly comments about my modest house or my generic brand groceries. By the time last Christmas rolled around, I had a hidden spreadsheet on my laptop labeled Family Transfers. I didn't create it out of malice. I created it out of pure self-defense. I got so incredibly tired of being gaslit about what I had and had not done for them. I logged the exact dates, the specific amounts, the pathetic excuses they gave me, and the empty promises of repayment. That brings us directly to Christmas Eve. Diane had strongly insisted we all celebrate at my place. She called me a week prior and claimed my studio home felt so much more festive and intimate for the holidays. Translated, that simply meant she did not want to cook a massive holiday meal or spend hours cleaning her own house. She showed up an hour late, bursting through the front door carrying a cheap plastic tray of store-bought cookies, expecting everyone to praise her contribution like it was a grand, generous offering. Megan arrived shortly after with Ben and her son. She brought a loud, chaotic energy that filled the small rooms but made the house feel completely cold. She walked into my front sitting room, took off her expensive coat, glanced at the handmade paper garlands Noah and Elsie had proudly taped along the bookcases, and smirked. "This is cute," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Crowded, but cute." I ignored her completely. My children were so excited. Noah was 8, and Elsie was 6. They were wearing matching red holiday sweaters, and they were still young enough to genuinely believe that family gatherings were supposed to feel safe, warm, and happy. Walter came in last. He stomped the snow off his heavy boots, took one heavy look at the noise, the discarded wrapping paper on the rug, the kids moving quickly between the adults, and his jaw set hard. I knew that specific look. I had known it since I was a little girl sitting in the backseat of his car. His expression always darkened rapidly when the joy in a room did not center entirely around him. At one point before dinner, little Elsie tugged on his sleeve. She was holding up a tiny, glittering star she had carefully glued onto a handmade place card specifically for him. She was beaming with absolute pride. He barely even glanced down at her. "Maybe later," he grunted, aggressively brushing his arm away from her small hands. She walked back to me, her bright smile faltering, and a sharp, hot wave of anger rolled over my nerves. I pulled her close and told her it was beautiful. At dinner, I was physically and emotionally exhausting myself trying to hold the room together. I passed the heavy bowls of mashed potatoes, poured hot apple cider into the glasses, checked on the roast in the oven, and forced a massive, fake smile for the sake of the kids. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Noah accidentally bumped his water glass with his elbow. It clattered loudly against his ceramic dinner plate. It did not break. Nothing spilled. It was just a sudden, sharp noise in a quiet room. Walter sighed theatrically, rolling his eyes dramatically at the ceiling. Diane gave me an exhausted, deeply disappointed look from across the table, acting as if I was personally responsible for the basic laws of physics and my son's lack of absolute perfection. Then Walter slowly stood up. He picked up his metal fork and tapped it sharply against his glass. The entire room went dead quiet. Megan actually hushed her son and looked up, her eyes wide with eager anticipation. She knew something was coming. Walter cleared his throat, puffed out his chest to make himself look as large as possible, and looked directly down the length of the table at me. "I have a Christmas announcement," he projected, using his loud contractor voice. "Since Claire seems to think this family is some kind of free service, your mother and I are done babysitting. We are done doing home repairs. We are done bailing her out every single time she cannot manage her own house or her own life." My stomach dropped straight into my shoes. Not because his cruel words hurt me, but because I saw exactly what he was actively doing. He had intentionally waited until both my son and daughter were sitting quietly at the table, watching and listening. He wanted them to hear that their mother was a pathetic, helpless burden. He wanted an audience for his grand display of power. I looked around the table. Diane looked down at her plate, perfectly silent, offering no defense. Megan pressed her lips together tightly, actively fighting a massive smirk. Ben stared awkwardly at his napkin, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Noah went completely still, his eyes darting between me and his grandfather. I slowly set my fork down. I looked Walter dead in the eye and said one word: "Seriously?" Walter nodded, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Seriously, you have been leaning on this family for way too long. You drain us. Maybe now you will finally learn how the real world works." I felt the very last string of my patience snap. The fear and the obligation I had carried for years simply vanished. I stood up, planting my hands firmly on the wooden table, leaning forward. "You watched me cover Mom's property taxes," I said, my voice dangerously calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You watched me help Megan keep her mortgage current so she wouldn't lose her house. You called me crying for your medical deductible, Walter. Do not stand in my own house, eat the food I paid for, and act like replacing a garbage disposal 3 Thanksgivings ago makes you my patron saint." The energy in the room completely shattered. Megan's head snapped up in shock. Diane gasped loudly, clutching her chest. "Claire, do not do this right now." Walter's face flushed a deep, furious red. The veins in his neck bulged. "Now you are keeping score?" he snapped, his voice booming and shaking the glasses on the table. "That tells me absolutely everything I need to know about your character." Before he could say another aggressive word, Elsie's small, shaking voice cut through the heavy, toxic air. "Mommy? Did Grandpa mean he does not want to come over anymore?" I looked down at my daughter's frightened, confused face. That was the absolute breaking point. The hesitation burned completely off. I was not going to let my children learn the terrible lesson I had been forced to learn. Swallowing public humiliation just to keep toxic family members close. I walked directly over to the front door, pulled my kids' heavy winter coats off the hooks, and looked back at the people sitting at my table. "Clearly, we are done here. We are leaving. If humiliating me in front of my own children was your grand idea of setting a boundary, do not worry. I will handle the rest." Walter barked something aggressive behind me about disrespect and knowing my place. Megan yelled that I was overreacting and ruining the holiday for everyone. But I did not turn around. I opened the door and walked out into the freezing night. I buckled the kids into the back seat of my car, my hands shaking so violently against the steering wheel I could barely put the key in the ignition. We drove away through the dark, quiet streets, leaving my family sitting in my house. Noah whispered from the back seat, his voice trembling. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror, took a deep breath, and softened my voice. "No, buddy, not us. We are just done pretending." Getting the kids to bed that night took much longer than it usually did. They were deeply unsettled, sensing the heavy, aggressive shift in the atmosphere, even if they didn't fully understand the cruel, calculated words that had been weaponized at the dinner table. When we got home, the house felt entirely different. Felt like a crime scene of a holiday. I sat on the edge of Elsie's bed, reading her an extra story about a brave little bear, tucking the heavy blankets tightly around her small shoulders, and promising her over and over that tomorrow, we would have our own special Christmas morning, just the three of us. By the time I finally closed their bedroom door and walked down the hallway, my entire body felt like it had been violently beaten. I walked into the kitchen. The remnants of the ruined dinner were still sitting on the counters. The roast was cold and congealing in the pan. The cider glasses were half full. I ignored absolutely all of it. I poured myself a glass of cold tap water, leaned against the sink, and finally checked my cell phone. I had 3 aggressive text messages from Megan. They read, "You are so unbelievably dramatic. How could you ruin a holiday over a simple boundary? And you need to apologize to Dad immediately." There was one single missed call from Diane. Nothing from Walter. I put the phone on silent, turned off the kitchen lights, crawled into my bed, and stared at the dark ceiling. My mind raced with anger, immense guilt, and pure exhaustion. I paced the floor of my bedroom for hours until sleep finally dragged me under. I woke up at 6:17 the next morning. My phone was vibrating so violently against the solid wooden nightstand that it nearly vibrated right off the edge and onto the floor. I rubbed my tired eyes, squinting painfully at the bright screen in the dark room. My lock screen was a solid, endless wall of urgent notifications. 36 missed calls, 11 voicemails, dozens of text messages. For a terrifying, dizzying second, my heart slammed aggressively against my ribs. The pure adrenaline spiked in my blood. I thought someone was dead. I thought Walter had suffered a massive heart attack in the middle of the night out of pure rage, or there had been a terrible car crash on their way home from my house. I swiped the screen open, my fingers fumbling and shaking in an absolute panic. But as I quickly scrolled through the long list of notifications, the sheer panic rapidly dissolved into a cold, hard, heavy knot in the pit of my stomach. The frantic calls were absolutely not from the local hospital. They were from Diane, from Megan, from my Aunt Joanne, from 2 different cousins who lived out of state. Even an old family friend, Susan from the church, who had absolutely no business having my personal cell phone number, had tried to call me twice. In my specific family dynamic, that exact pattern of frantic, wide-scale communication only meant one thing. Somebody had already turned the narrative into a massive public event. The spin machine was working overtime. I opened my text messages first, bracing myself for the impact. "Call your mother right now. She is devastated. Claire, what on earth did you say to your father? He is furious. Take down whatever you posted immediately. You are ruining the family reputation. How could you do this to them on Christmas of all days?" My jaw clenched so hard my back teeth actually ached. I hadn't posted anything on social media. I had been asleep, which meant Diane had. I quickly opened the Facebook app. Sure enough, right at the very top of my news feed was a long, dramatic post from Diane. The timestamp showed it was published at 1:12 a.m. while I was fast asleep. She had attached a carefully cropped, beautiful, warm photo of my dining room table from earlier in the evening, taken right before the screaming started. The candles were glowing softly, the plates looked perfect and inviting, and Noah and Elsie were blurred happily in the background. It looked like a magazine cover for the perfect family holiday. The caption she wrote above it made my blood run entirely cold. It read, "Some people only know how to take and take from family until the exact moment loving, healthy boundaries are finally set. This has been the absolute hardest Christmas of my entire life. My heart is completely broken. But sometimes, protecting your peace and your marriage costs you a daughter's anger. Walter and I are leaning on our faith tonight, praying for healing and understanding." Beneath her masterful, incredibly manipulative performance, the comments were already piling up by the dozens. Women from her church group, extended family members, and old neighbors were leaving praying hands emojis and long paragraphs of absolute support. "Praying for you and Walter, Diane. Boundaries matter so much in these difficult times. Grandparents are not free labor. Kids today are so unbelievably entitled and selfish. It is so deeply sad when grown daughters do not appreciate the endless, exhausting sacrifices their parents make for them. And right in the middle of it all, a highly visible comment from my sister, Megan. So incredibly proud of you and Dad for finally speaking up and protecting yourselves from the constant draining. We love you. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the glowing screen for a full 60 seconds. I could not move. I felt my chest tightening, my breathing growing fast and shallow. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. My own mother had sat at my dining table, eaten the expensive roast I paid for, watched my father verbally and emotionally abuse me in front of my own young children, and then went home, got into her comfortable bed, and typed out a massive, calculated lie to hundreds of people just to make herself look like a tragically misunderstood martyr. She had intentionally turned me into a lazy, entitled parasite for the entire community to judge, just to protect Walter's fragile ego. She wanted witnesses. She wanted an audience to validate her twisted delusion and comfort her. I slowly stood up. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet, but I didn't care. The sadness, the heavy guilt, the desperate, lifelong need to be a good daughter that I had carried around for 34 years completely evaporated in that exact moment. It was instantly replaced by a sharp, clinical, unshakable coldness. The Claire who absorbed the abuse was gone. Diane wanted a public audience? Fine. I knew exactly how to give her one. I didn't call her. I didn't reply to any of the frantic, accusatory text messages from my cousins. I walked out of my bedroom, went straight down the hall into my restoration studio, pushed past the heavy iron book presses drying my latest project, and opened my laptop. I pulled up my online banking portal. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room. I navigated to the secure folder on my desktop labeled Family Transfers. I sat there in my thick winter robe, my morning coffee completely forgotten and going ice cold beside me, and started pulling the screenshots. I did not need to exaggerate. I did not need to yell or use emotional language. I just needed the raw, undeniable, irrefutable math. Math does not lie. I looked at the numbers glowing brightly on the screen, verifying every single detail. Diane's property taxes from April, $2,143. Paid directly from my checking account to the city clerk. Megan's mortgage shortfall when Ben missed his promotion at the firm, $1,800. And then another $900 transferred the very next month. Walter's medical deductible for his knee surgery, $3,275. Paid directly to the hospital billing department. The deposit for my nephew's braces. A massive emergency furnace repair bill for my parents' house. 2 separate utility shut-off reversals for Diane's house when she forgot to pay the electric bill. Every single transaction was neatly logged. Every bank transfer was time-stamped with the exact date and minute. And right next to them in the folder were the screenshots of the exact text messages that accompanied the requests. Diane begging and pleading. Megan promising to pay me back from her very next paycheck. Walter aggressively demanding I keep the money a secret from his golfing buddies so he wouldn't look weak. I didn't need to post all of it. I only needed enough to permanently puncture the massive, bloated lie Diane had confidently floated into the public square. I went back to the open Facebook tab, clicked on Diane's ridiculous post, and typed a single comment. I didn't use all caps. I didn't use exclamation points. I didn't call her names. The pure power was in the absolute calmness and the surgical specificity of the truth. I wrote, "Loving boundaries. That is a very interesting phrase, Mom. Since we are having this deeply personal conversation in public for everyone to see, let's make sure the details are perfectly accurate. In the last 2 years alone, I have personally paid your property taxes $2,143, Dad's medical deductible, $3,275. Megan's mortgage shortfall, $2,700 total, Ben's braces deposit, and 2 of your overdue utility bills to keep your lights on, Dad watched all of that happen before standing up in my house last night and telling my children that I live off of him because he babysat twice a month. If you truly want peace and healing, maybe you should start with basic honesty. I hit enter. I didn't attach the screenshots yet. I knew I didn't have to show my entire hand immediately. Diane knew I could back up every single word. I sat back in my desk chair, crossed my arms, and watched the screen. For 3 agonizingly long minutes, absolutely nothing happened. The post sat there perfectly still. Then, the comment count suddenly jumped from 42 to 45. My cell phone rang loudly on the desk. The caller ID flashed Diane's name. I stared at it and hit decline. 2 seconds later, Megan called. I hit decline. Then, for the absolute first time since he stormed out of my house the night before, Walter called. I hit decline. I refreshed the Facebook page. My Aunt Joanne, my mother's older sister and the absolute only person in the entire extended family whose opinion Diane actually feared and respected, had replied directly to my comment. Wait, Claire, what are you talking about? Diane told us you were drowning in legal debt from the divorce. Megan immediately jumped into the thread, typing frantically, desperately trying to do damage control in real time. Aunt Joanne, Claire is completely twisting the context of private family help. She is just angry and acting out maliciously about last night's argument. That was the exact trigger I was waiting for. Megan had opened the door. I replied to Megan's comment with one single screenshot. It was a text from Diane from April that read, Claire, please, I am begging you, can you cover the tax bill before Friday? We are desperate. Do not tell your father I asked you. Then I dropped a second screenshot right below it. A text from Walter. Insurance wants the deductible upfront before they operate. Wire the money today. Don't mention this to your mother yet. I will handle her. The mood underneath the post shifted with the brutal, violent speed of a car crash. It was instantaneous. The church friends who had just spent hours comforting Diane suddenly went dead silent. Nobody liked a hypocrite, especially in their tight-knit social circles. Then, one by one, the sharper, much more accusatory questions started rolling in from the family. A cousin wrote, Diane, why did Claire pay your property taxes if she is the one dependent on you guys like you said? A family friend commented, Megan, didn't the church do a huge fundraiser for your hard season last year? Claire was paying your mortgage on top of that. And then came the absolute kill shot. Aunt Joanne left a standalone comment at the very bottom of the thread. Diane, if you made a liar out of all of us today just to protect Walter's pride, you need to say it right now. Tell the truth. I watched that comment appear on the screen, and a profound, heavy weight physically lifted off my chest. I felt a deep, radiating calm I had not experienced in years. It wasn't joy. It wasn't exactly happiness. It was just the incredible feeling of standing up straight after putting down a massive boulder I had been carrying on my back for a decade. 7 minutes later, the screen went completely blank. An error message popped up. Diane had panicked, realized she was trapped, and deleted the entire post. But it was way too late. The internet is forever. The screenshots were already moving rapidly through the family group chats. My phone buzzed with a furious voice memo from Megan. She was screaming so loud the audio clipped and distorted. Walter left a seething voicemail calling me a vicious, ungrateful brat who is dead to me. Diane texted a single, pathetic sentence. You could have handled this privately. I actually laughed out loud in my empty kitchen. Public humiliation at my Christmas dinner table in front of my children was perfectly fine for them, but one factual, mathematically correct correction on the internet was suddenly a massive violation of privacy. By noon, the tide had completely turned. Relatives were calling me not to scold me, but to ask if I was okay. My cousin Natalie texted, I always thought something was weird about how your parents talked about you. I am so sorry. Even Megan's husband, Ben, sent me a private message. It just said, I am so sorry, Claire. I swear to you, I didn't know it was your money. That was the first real crack in the foundation. The grand performance of the Bennett family had always depended entirely on my absolute silence. The minute I stopped protecting them, They were exposed to the harsh light of reality. And they looked exactly like what they were. The following days were absolutely not like a dramatic movie montage. There was no grand epiphany where my parents suddenly saw the error of their ways, rushed to my front door, and collapsed in tears of sincere remorse. Toxic family systems simply do not work like that. When confronted with undeniable truth, they double down on the delusion. Diane spent the entire week calling relatives, crying hysterically on the phone, claiming I had weaponized money and was keeping score against normal acts of parental love. Walter went to the local hardware store, found his old contractor buddies, and told them I was mentally unstable, deeply bitter about my divorce and custody arrangement, and actively trying to keep him away from his beloved grandchildren out of pure, unadulterated spite. Megan played her favorite middle tactic, telling everyone in her circle that my tone was the real problem, completely ignoring the massive fact that they had lied to everyone and effectively stolen from me. But they had a massive, insurmountable problem. They couldn't talk their way out of this time. Receipts do not respect family hierarchy. I didn't waste a single second of my time arguing with their pathetic smear campaign. I was far too busy doing something much more important. I was actively, systematically closing off every single access point they had to my life and my finances. I logged into my banking portal. I permanently canceled the recurring auto transfer I had set up months ago to help Diane with her upcoming spring taxes. I logged into the commercial account at the local hardware store and permanently removed my credit card, the card Walter still occasionally used to buy materials for his own house projects, assuming I would just quietly pay the statement at the end of the month to avoid an ugly fight. I blocked Megan's cell phone number entirely, permanently cutting off the weekly text messages that almost always ended with her asking for a quick $50 for groceries or gas. I redirected all of that freed up money back into my high-yield savings account, back into my salary pool, and back into Noah and Elsie's college fund, where it truly belonged all along. When I sat the kids down in the living room to explain why we wouldn't be seeing Grandpa and Grandma for a while, I kept the language as simple and gentle as possible. Noah nodded slowly, his young eyes holding a serious, deep understanding that broke my heart a little. Elsie looked up at me, her lower lip trembling, and asked, "Mommy, did I do something bad with the place card? Is that why Grandpa is mad?" I got down on the floor, pulled her tightly into my lap, and hugged her until she stopped shaking. "No, baby, you did absolutely nothing wrong. Sometimes grown-ups act badly because nobody ever taught them how to be kind or how to tell the truth." A week after Christmas, Walter, Diane, and Megan realized their back-channel gossiping and manipulation wasn't working anymore. The extended family wasn't taking their side. Ben had completely separated his finances from Megan after realizing she had lied to him about where the bailout money was coming from. Walter was catching dirty, knowing looks at his local diner from men he used to command respect from. They were rapidly losing their grip on their carefully crafted reality. So they aggressively demanded an in-person meeting. They wanted to meet at a neutral, brightly lit diner off Route 1. I agreed to go, mostly because I needed to look them in the eye one last time in broad daylight to be absolutely sure there was nothing left to save. I walked into the diner wearing my heavy winter coat, dark jeans, and boots. The smell of stale coffee and fried grease hung in the air. Walter was already sitting in the vinyl corner booth, his face red and puffy, a cup of black coffee in front of him. Diane was clutching a paper napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces, looking extremely nervous. Megan slid in next to her, crossing her arms tightly like she was preparing for a physical war. I slid into the opposite side of the booth. I didn't take off my coat. "You have exactly 10 minutes, I said, looking directly at Walter. Walter immediately puffed up, using the loud, booming voice he thought projected absolute authority. "You went way too far this time, Claire. Whatever problems we have behind closed doors, you do not shame your family in public. You embarrassed me." I stared at him, my face completely blank. "You stood up at my Christmas table and called me a financial burden in front of my own children." He waved a large hand dismissively. "I was setting boundaries. You need to learn independence. You rely on us too much." "No," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet but completely steady. "You were performing. You wanted to feel big, so you tried to make me small. You wanted an audience. Megan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Everyone is exhausted by your resentment ledger. Claire, you hold money over our heads like a weapon. Megan, I said, cutting her off instantly, pointing a finger at her. You have been taking my money for 2 straight years while letting Mom tell the entire church congregation I am barely scraping by. Do not ever confuse my silence with dependence. The booth went dead quiet. The waitress walked by and quickly hurried away. Walter let out a short, ugly, condescending laugh. There it is. You always were exactly like your mother. You keep score. You hold grudges. You make every piece of kindness transactional. Years ago, that specific accusation would have gutted me. It would have sent me spiraling into tears and frantic apologies, desperately reaching for my wallet to prove my unconditional love. But sitting in that diner, looking at his angry, entitled face, I felt absolutely nothing but pure clarity. Because what he had offered me my entire life wasn't kindness. It was control dressed up as sacrifice. I stood up from the booth. Walter actually looked startled, his eyes widening slightly, as if he genuinely believed his booming voice was a physical restraint that could keep me seated. I pulled a crisp $20 bill out of my pocket, dropped it flat on the table to cover their coffees, and looked down at my father. You do not get to see Noah and Elsie anymore, I said clearly, enunciating every single word. Not until they are old enough to understand exactly what emotional cruelty looks like. You do not get to drop by my house. You do not get to call my phone. And since you care so much about what family means, Walter, here is your final lesson. Family is not an audience for your ego. Diane gasped loudly, her face going completely pale. Megan stammered, You can't just do that. You can't cut us off. I looked down at my sister. Watch me. I turned around and walked out of the diner. The small bell on the glass door chimed cheerfully behind me. I stepped out into the freezing January air, the wind biting sharply at my cheeks. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. I left them sitting in that booth, completely speechless, finally stripped of the one thing they valued more than anything else in the world. My silence. What happened over the next few weeks was not some dramatic, sweeping movie montage where everyone instantly learned their lesson and begged for forgiveness. Real life is much messier than that, which honestly made it significantly more satisfying in its own unique way. The complete collapse of my family's fake reality was a slow, quiet, and absolutely devastating process for them. Later, the exact same night of our intense diner meeting, Megan's husband, Ben, called me. He sounded physically exhausted, like a man who had just run a marathon. He told me that Megan had come home from the diner absolutely furious, pacing the length of their living room, aggressively ranting about how disrespectful and cruel I was. But Walter had followed them back to their house. Walter barged straight through their front door, demanding that Ben get his wife in line and loudly complaining about his own entitlement to my salary and my time. Ben had finally had enough. He walked Walter right out onto the front porch, standing under the bright porch light right in front of the neighbors' houses. Ben pointed a finger directly at my father's chest and told him he was absolutely no longer welcome in their home until he learned the clear, distinct difference between helping his children and dominating them. That specific detail mattered to me a lot more than I initially expected. Not because I needed a man to validate my personal experience, but because deeply controlling men like Walter completely depend on the silence and compliance of other men to maintain their power. The absolute second Ben stood up straight and refused to play along with the charade, Walter lost his primary audience. He lost his grip. From there, the social exile officially began. It was small on paper, but for people who are entirely obsessed with their public image, it was a living nightmare. Diane completely stopped being invited to host the large extended family Sunday lunches. My aunts and cousins politely but firmly declined her weekly invitations because absolutely nobody trusted her version of events anymore. They had all seen the receipts. She could no longer go to her church group and play the tragically misunderstood victim, because the women sitting in the wooden pews right next to her had seen the undeniable bank transfer screenshots with their own eyes. When she tried to bring up my name to garner sympathy, they changed the subject. That kind of silence is deafening to a narcissist. Megan's social media feeds got noticeably quieter. She completely stopped posting her perfectly curated, heavily filtered family content. She simply could not post beautiful, fake holiday traditions without people in the comments remembering exactly what had actually happened and who had really paid for her lavish lifestyle. Her husband's missed promotion no longer seemed like an excuse for her to act superior. As for Walter, the loud, booming man who loved absolutely nothing more than being consulted as the ultimate authority on everything, he stopped getting phone calls. His old contractor buddies stopped asking him for practical advice on their home projects. They had seen the absolute truth. One of his oldest friends, a guy who had known him for 30 years, actually cornered him at the local hardware store. He looked Walter straight in the face and told him that a real man does not brag about his immense pride while his daughter secretly pays his medical bills. That kind of public exile is an incredibly heavy weight to carry. Still, Walter did not apologize to me. He doubled down aggressively. He told anyone who would listen that my bitter divorce had completely ruined my mind. He claimed I was maliciously weaponizing my kids against him just to win a petty argument. He told Diane I would eventually break down, run out of money, and come crawling back to them, desperately begging for their approval because that was what I had always done in the past. He was completely and utterly wrong. I spent the rest of that cold winter focusing entirely on my work, my deep peace of mind, and my 2 children. I poured all my energy into restoring beautiful, broken things in my studio. My lawyer finally finalized the very last bits of stressful paperwork regarding my strict custody schedule with my ex-husband, securing my absolute boundaries on that front as well. I took the money I used to waste on my family and poured it directly into Noah and Elsie's college fund. For the absolute first time in my entire adult life, my house was actually quiet. There were no sudden manufactured crises. There were no aggressive emergency demands for cash. There was just the rich smell of old paper, the calming sound of the rain hitting the glass windows, and the absolute unshakable certainty that I was finally safe in my own home. A little over 3 months later, on a very gray, bitterly cold Tuesday afternoon in early March, I got a phone call that proved exactly how deeply Walter had underestimated my boundaries. I was standing quietly in my restoration studio with a severely damaged, half-repaired 19th century Atlas open under my hands. I was carefully applying specialized archive glue to a broken leather spine when my cell phone rang loudly on the wooden workbench. The screen lit up with an unknown local number. I wiped my sticky hands on my heavy canvas apron and picked it up. A woman with a very brisk, professional, clinical voice asked if she was speaking directly to Claire Bennett. I said yes. She officially identified herself as a charge nurse working at a major hospital over in Cranston. She took a breath and told me that Walter Bennett had been brought into the emergency room by ambulance 2 hours earlier. He had suffered what she described as a serious but highly survivable stroke. Because Diane had listed me as the primary emergency contact years and years earlier, back when I handled absolutely everything for them, and had apparently never bothered to update her official paperwork, my name was still the very first one to pop up in the hospital computer system. I stood there in the perfectly quiet studio. I looked down at the old, worn wood boards of the floor. I listened silently while the nurse efficiently and rapidly explained the immediate medical need for overnight observation, the potential long timeline for physical rehab, and the strict necessity of family notification. I did not panic. I did not drop the phone in shock. I did not start crying. I just took a slow, deep, measured breath. I thanked the nurse politely for her time, clearly told her that my mother Diane should be the primary contact moving forward, gave her Diane's direct cell phone number, and hung up the phone. I stood completely still for a very long minute. No matter how thoroughly and completely done you are with an abusive parent, there are some phone calls your physical body still receives like a sudden, violent change in the weather. A cold, sharp chill ran down my arms. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the bench. It was a text message from Megan. It read, "Dad had a stroke. Please do not make this harder than it is. We are at Cranston Hospital. Look closely at those words. She did not say, "Please come, we need you." She did not say, "We are so sorry." It was just the exact same old demanding request, wrapped tightly in a sudden medical emergency, ordering me to step right back into my lifelong role to smooth over their deep discomfort. I did not reply to her text. Instead, I called my Aunt Joanne. I asked her for the absolute, unfiltered truth of the situation. She told me she had just spoken to Diane in the waiting room. Megan was pacing the hospital hallways nervously. Walter was awake and conscious. His speech was heavily slurred from the stroke, and he had actively asked for me twice. Then Joanne paused on the phone, her voice softening with sadness. "Asked is probably way too generous a word, Claire. He demanded you. He got incredibly angry when the nurse told him you weren't there yet. He is terrified, yes, but he is still Walter. He hasn't changed." I thanked Joanne sincerely and ended the call. I sat down heavily on the floor of my workroom. I looked closely at the grain in the wood while Noah and Elsie colored happily at their small craft table in the corner of the room. They were completely safe. They were completely unaware of the massive, toxic undertow trying one more time to violently drag their mother back out to sea. This is the exact part of the story where Hollywood movies usually force a clean, tidy, heartwarming moral lesson on the audience. The estranged, angry daughter hears her abusive father is suddenly weak and lying in a stark hospital bed. The daughter suddenly remembers he is only human and that life is incredibly short. The daughter rushes into the hospital waiting room, tears streaming down her face. The father sees the profound error of his ways. They hug tightly, and all the terrible years of severe financial and emotional abuse are instantly forgiven and erased by the glowing monitors of the ICU. I need you to listen to me and know that real life did not do that for me. What I felt sitting on that studio floor was absolutely not a petty desire for revenge. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of every single time I had completely abandoned my own dignity just so Walter and Diane could keep their fragile, bloated egos perfectly intact. I vividly thought about Walter standing aggressively at my Christmas table, loudly announcing I was a worthless burden. I thought about Elsie's tiny, shaking voice asking if Grandpa didn't want to come anymore. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated audacity of that diner meeting. People love to romanticize sickness. Society acts as if physical frailty automatically creates deep, sincere moral remorse. Let me tell you a hard truth. It doesn't. Sometimes, severe sickness only removes the physical energy for the grand performance, leaving the exact same entitled, toxic person aggressively demanding access to your life without offering a single ounce of accountability. 2 full days later, after carefully arranging and paying for a trusted babysitter to watch Noah and Elsie, I drove my car to the Cranston Hospital. I did not go because I had suddenly changed my mind. I did not go out of guilt. I went because I wanted to be absolutely 100% certain that my final decision was made in the clear, sharp light of day. I did not want to look back in 10 or 20 years and wonder if I had acted purely out of temporary anger. I needed to look the situation directly in the eye and see it for exactly what it was. Walter had been officially moved from the chaotic emergency room up to the quieter ICU step-down unit. The long, bright hallways smelled sharply of strong antiseptic and stale coffee. When I slowly turned the corner into the designated waiting area, Diane saw me immediately. She stood up from the vinyl chair so quickly I thought she might actually faint right there on the linoleum floor. She looked 10 years older, completely drained. Her eyes filled with heavy tears instantly. "Claire," she breathed, reaching her arms out as if the sound of my name alone should instantly erase the past 4 months of absolute hell she put me through. I kept my physical distance. I did not step toward her. I looked at her directly and asked one single, clear question. "Did he apologize?" Diane slowly lowered her hand. She looked completely stricken, her eyes darting nervously away from mine. That was all the answer I needed. "He wants to see the kids, Claire," she whispered desperately, completely ignoring my very direct question. "He is asking for Noah and Elsie." "No," I said firmly, my voice leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. She started crying deeply then, using the heavy, theatrical, loud sobs she usually strictly reserved for manipulating her church friends. Life is so incredibly short, Claire. Families regret things when it is too late. Walter is scared. He is so scared. He didn't mean so much of what he said at Christmas. You have to be the bigger person here. You have to forgive. I listened quietly to her desperate excuses. I looked hard at the woman who had happily and maliciously tried to destroy my personal reputation on the internet just to protect a man who bullied her daily. I felt a profound, heavy wave of pity wash over me. She had spent her entire adult life meticulously building her marriage around making Walter's unpredictable emotional, whether everybody else's direct problem. And now, even a massive medical catastrophe couldn't buy back what his vicious, stubborn pride had permanently cost him. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady and calm. Fear of physical consequences is not the same thing as feeling genuine regret for causing harm. Diane covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a loud sob. I walked right past her, down the short, brightly lit hallway, and stopped directly outside Walter's private hospital room. A large, thick glass window looked directly into the clinical space. I stood still at the glass and looked closely at him. He was awake. He looked very gray-faced, noticeably smaller and deflated in the stark white hospital bed. One side of his mouth was slightly altered and drooping from the stroke. The heavy medical machinery surrounding him, beeping rhythmically, made the entire scene feel both deeply tragic and oddly, completely impersonal. His eyes slowly moved toward the door. They found me standing quietly behind the thick glass. Even then, even incredibly weak, attached to 4 tubes, wearing a hospital gown, and completely stripped of his booming, intimidating contractor voice, I saw it. I saw the immediate flash of deep, familiar anger before I saw any trace of shame or regret. He was absolutely furious that I was standing safely on the other side of the glass, completely out of his immediate control. He lifted one heavy, shaking hand slightly off the thin hospital blanket, aggressively beckoning me to come inside the room. It was absolutely not a request. It was a firm command. I did not move a single inch. I stood there, meeting his angry gaze right through the thick glass, long enough for him to see me perfectly clearly, long enough for him to fully understand that my physical distance was a deliberate, permanent choice, not a temporary accident. I was not a scared, obedient little girl anymore. I was a strong mother aggressively protecting her peace. And then, I calmly turned around. Diane said my name one more time from down the hall, sharp with complete disbelief. Megan stepped out of the waiting room, staring at me with her mouth open like I had just broken some sacred, unbreakable rule of the universe. Maybe I had. Maybe the unspoken, sacred rule in the Bennett family had always been that Claire absorbs the heavy hits. Claire explains away the abuse. Claire quietly opens her wallet to fix the mistakes. Claire always returns when summoned. Not anymore. I walked swiftly out of the hospital, pushed aggressively through the heavy sliding glass doors into the crisp, cold air, got into my car, and finally cried. I gripped the leather steering wheel and cried so hard my chest physically ached. I had to sit there and wait 10 full minutes before my vision cleared enough to safely drive. I was absolutely not crying because I thought I had made the wrong decision. I was crying because I finally realized that sometimes the absolute right decision is still filled with a massive, crushing amount of grief. I was mourning the loving, supportive father I truly deserved, the one I was absolutely never going to get. In the many months following that pivotal hospital visit, my life finally settled into a beautiful, permanent, and healthy new shape. Walter was eventually moved from the hospital into a physical rehab center, and then permanently into a much smaller assisted living arrangement. Diane simply could not physically or emotionally manage his demanding care alone, and because they had systematically alienated absolutely everyone in their lives, no one volunteered to step into their toxic orbit to provide free labor. Megan kept very cautious, distant contact with them, mostly because Ben had laid down the law and made it crystal clear there would be absolutely no more hidden financial debts. no more secret loans, and absolutely no more rewriting family history in his house. Aunt Joanne stayed very close to me. She came over for warm coffee on Sunday mornings and never once pushed me to reconcile with them. Noah and Elsie completely stopped asking about Grandpa Walter. Kids are incredibly resilient, and they adjust surprisingly quickly when the adults in their lives actively stop making emotional instability the daily climate of the house. As for me, I just kept working hard. I kept quietly rebuilding my savings account. I kept restoring beautiful, broken books in my quiet studio, which felt deeply and poetically fitting. I learned a lot from my specific trade. Some things can be beautifully repaired, but only if the binding is honest and the damage is properly named and meticulously cleaned. And some things are so deeply rotted and destroyed, they can only be carefully preserved behind glass as stark evidence of what they survived. Last Christmas, exactly 1 full year after the terrible dinner that cracked my entire world open, my house was full of genuine joy. Noah happily helped me string warm, yellow lights completely across the studio doorway. Elsie sat happily at the kitchen table, aggressively stamping little gold stars onto handmade paper gift tags. We baked fresh cookies that absolutely did not come from a cheap plastic tray. There was no thick tension in the air. There was no grand, aggressive, humiliating speech. There was absolutely no one tapping a metal fork against a water glass to make me feel incredibly small in my own home. There was just peace. Real, deep, hard-earned, beautiful peace. The exact kind of peace my mother tried to fake in that midnight Facebook post and never actually understood. If you are listening to this right now and wondering whether I harbor any deep, lingering regrets about turning my back and walking away from that hospital room window, the honest, unfiltered answer is no. I regret that I ever foolishly believed familial love required me to stand perfectly still while someone actively humiliated me. I deeply regret that my 2 beautiful children ever had to sit at a dining table and watch me try to absorb that kind of cruelty. But walking away from the glass? No. I confidently chose my sanity. I firmly chose my financial independence. Most importantly, I chose my children. I chose to be the exact version of myself they truly deserve to learn from. So, I will leave you with the ultimate heavy question Walter forced me to answer for myself, standing there in the cold, sterile hospital hallway. If the person who hurt you the most in this entire world was finally physically weak enough to truly need you, but still not emotionally honest enough to own the profound damage they caused, what would you do? Would you walk in, or would you walk away? Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a heavy one, but getting it out there feels like dropping a massive weight off my shoulders. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? If you are hearing this right now, it means you made it to the very end of the video. You are part of what I call the 1% Club. I have a special favor to ask. Drop the letter W in the comments. Just a single W. It stands for winner. It is our secret signal so I can easily recognize the amazing people who stuck with me through the whole journey and chose to be winners in their own lives by setting healthy boundaries. If my story helped you feel a little less alone today, please hit that like button and follow the channel. It tells the algorithm to share this with other people who might really need to hear it right now. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.